This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.
Good afternoon, a very warm welcome to our IIEA webinar today on Ireland's cybersecurity challenges. My name is Joyce O'Connor and I chair the digital group here at the IIEA, and I'm delighted to be with you today. It's my great pleasure now to welcome our distinguished speaker, Dr. Richard Brown, who's the director of the National Cybersecurity Centre. Richard, you're very welcome, and we're delighted that you're with us today, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thanks, Joyce, and thank you very much for the invitation. I am going to endeavour to share my screen. Hopefully
we're just, if you could just hold on 1 minute, just going to give it a kind of overview of what's going to happen next, Richard. So Richard will speak for around 20 to 25 minutes, and then I'll go to you, our audience, for any comments or questions that you may have on Richard's presentation. You can join us using the Q&A function as usual on your screen, at the bottom of your screen. And please feel free, as I said, to send in your questions or any comments during Richard's presentation. I'd very much appreciate if you would give your name and that of your organisation when you're asking a question. And please feel free to join us on our discussion on Twitter using the handle @IIEA. So today then, as I said, we're going to talk about Ireland's cybersecurity challenges. And in a world where cybersecurity is now a target for geopolitical tension, criminal enterprise and technological distribution, Ireland, like every digitally advanced nation, faces complex evolving threats. Today, we are really lucky in having Richard Brown with us. Richard has a wealth of experience and insight for his presentation today. He's head of the Centre, National Centre for Cybersecurity, and he plays a role in shaping Ireland's cybersecurity policy, advising government, working with industry partners, coordinating our national response to cyber threats in an increasingly volatile digital landscape. And his leadership spans operational responsibility for incident response, strategic policy advice, and the implementation of the National Cybersecurity Framework, including enhancing compliance and enforcement across critical infrastructure. And today, Richard will cover the work of the National Cybersecurity Centre, the current state of play, his perspective on the current cybersecurity landscape and risks in Ireland. Also, of course, doing that within a global context. He sets out the upcoming challenges and the steps that he brings to build resilience across government, business and society. He will also discuss the NIS Directive 2. Finally, Richard will look at what happens next, looking at the Technology Directive and the implementation of the national strategy from 2019 to 2024 and the upcoming challenges that the next cybersecurity strategy will seek to address. So, Richard, it's over to you, and we really look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joyce. And thank you very much. I'm going to endeavour once again to try and share my slides. There we go. That should do it. Hope that works.
Yep, perfect.
Great. So good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for your time on a lovely sunny, well, at least sunny in Dublin afternoon. I'm going to run through three issues relatively briefly, as Joyce has pointed out. I'm happy to take any questions anybody might have after the fact. I'm going to go through what the NCSC is and does, and I'm going to give, at least as quickly as I can, a brief understanding or overview of what cybersecurity practically means in the world today. Then I'm going to go through, in slightly greater detail, the NIS directives, plural, how they fit into the overarching European policy framework and how they seek to respond to some of the challenges in cybersecurity in the contemporary environment. And then I'm going to briefly at the end jump into what's next. So the upcoming challenges, the things that the NCSC is heavily involved in doing right now, and things that are coming next in terms of national strategies and our own internal development. So that's thing one, that's the general overview. So to begin with, introduction and overview. So the NCSC has currently, we're working on the basis of a 4-year plan out to 2028 with 5 strategic objectives. The first of these is to protect and defend against threats in the cyber domain. We do that by monitoring, detecting and responding to incidents. We do that by responding to incidents that are reported to us. And we do that by a number of other means, which we'll come to in a moment. But essentially our job is to ensure that bad things online don't disrupt the services and then the lives of the people who live in this country. That's one bit. The second bit is behind that. We build capacity and we embed cyber resilience in the state. That is to say that our job is to go out to work with critical infrastructure and government and other parties and ensure that they are fully informed as to the risks that affect them and that they understand the measures that they now need to take to meet those risks. And some of those measures involve formal regulatory work, which we do by means of our oversight and compliance function. Now, I'll come back to this in some more detail, but essentially we have a number of different regulatory functions sitting within the NCSC, unusually. So we're both gamekeeper and poacher at the same time, which poses its own challenges. But for critical infrastructure, we tell them they're critical. We go to them, we legally oblige them to do things under European law, and then we ensure that over time they build towards becoming more resilient and more compliant. And then, of course, in theory at least, that their services are better prepared to deal with what the future might hold. Fourthly, we have a substantial national and international coordination and collaboration role. Cyber, unsurprisingly, is a global challenge. There's a huge amount of interaction, engagement, and cooperation at international level. A lot of this is within the European Union and other regional security structures like NATO. So more of it is bilateral, with very strong, as you might expect, bilateral relationships with the US, the UK, our friends in Australia and New Zealand, South Korea, and so on. So that's a really important part of our work, and it's a huge part nationally. Again, I don't have much in the slides on it, but if anybody wants detail, we have loads. And then lastly, we have a substantial internal goal now around transforming our own technology, digital, and supporting services. I'll come back to this a little bit at the end, but very long story, cut very short. NCSC was founded in 2011. And with the C-Cert and the operational functions were fully certified in 2017. A lot of our infrastructure and a lot of our supporting architecture stems or flows from that period. So because we're moving into a new building and because we've moved into a new building and we had the opportunity to rebuild our IT infrastructure, we've done that. So having rebuilt our data centers, having established an entirely new foundation for our work, now we're building on top of that. And some of that work is visible, some more will be visible in the next couple of months. So very briefly, that's our structure. We have 4 directorates in the NCSC, operations, which primarily do incident response, monitoring, scanning, etc. We have a resilience directorate, which is much more diverse. Engagement, capacity building, and corporate affairs should be kind of obvious. The first one there, I think, is probably of more general interest to people. That's strategic analysis. We have a substantial role in providing strategic analysis, plural, of what developments in cybersecurity mean for the state. Okay, so what does it mean? What does it show about what other parties in the world are seeking to do to us? What does it show what they're trying to do to everybody else? This team informs government, it informs across government to ensure that people understand what cyber means for them in a practical, real-world geopolitical sense. That team also handles what we call emerging disruptive technologies like AI, post-quantum, and so on. There's a lot more to that too. We can go into if anybody really needs to. So lastly on this, the compliance team is new. It's being established in this format for NIS2, and we're in the process very shortly of hiring a new director of compliance. Hopefully we'll have an ad in the paper in the next little while on that. So cyber, what does it mean? Everybody generically understands what cybersecurity is. It's the fact that we've built this global constellation of devices and networks, and then over time we've come to rely on the devices connected to those networks for everything that we do, for everything from our banking to our critical infrastructure like electricity, water, and so on, but also to our personal lives, to our interpersonal communication, to the services, to our government. It's everything. This is long since we recognized in national risk assessments here, in global risk assessments. That document there is obviously from a global body. There's a vaster range of national ones. I've pulled one out in particular. This is our national cyber risk assessments that we published from the NCSC in 2023. It's a 2022 document. This underpinned the midterm review of the strategy, which was finished in 23. People will note that in that list there, you'll have nation state, criminal, terrorists or activists, and unintentional acts. Okay, and the red, obviously, red, amber, green, yellow refers to the seriousness of the incidents. It's self-explanatory. Governments are vulnerable to particularly espionage, data manipulation, and from other governments. But then you have everything else applies to everybody. So you can have situations where charities, small groups can be subject of state-led attacks. You can have situations where very high-tier targets like governments can be subject to attacks from low-tier actors. It is literally limitless. And of course, the other thing to keep in mind in all of this is, don't forget Agent Murphy. Murphy's Law applies, in other words. This time last year, we had a substantial global incident, and I'll come back to it in detail in a second, around a CrowdStrike update. So this was a cybersecurity company pushing an update to thousands of customers globally, but it bricked machines. So it shut airports, it shut banks, it shut government departments because it pushed a bad update. That was a cybersecurity incident. It caused real disruption. There was no bad actor. It was just an accident. And by many analysis, up to 80, 90% of cybersecurity incidents are just that. They're accidents. So don't forget Murphy's Law. Okay, really quickly, deep dive, and this is going to get geeky for a minute, so forgive me and bear with me. Cyber risk isn't binary, okay? It's not something that happens or doesn't happen. It's not something that's an on-off switch, despite the fact that it's fundamentally digital in nature. Cyber risk is amorphous and fluid, it's asymmetric, and it's geopolitical and arbitrary. Metaphors matter here. We're used to thinking of, some of us, those of a particular vintage, of security issues as being like the scene from The Seventh Seal, like this metaphor for nuclear war, that it's either we're going to have a conflict or we're not, that you're going to have, someone is going to use cyber or they're not. Sorry, I have lots of more arcane metaphors for this, but in simple terms, cyber isn't like this cold, ascetic conflict. Cyber is much more akin to a bar fight in an old Western, where everything happens all the time. And the only real question is, what is the level of force that is brought to bear in that fight? So don't think of this as a ascetic, cold chess with death. Think of this instead as a bar fight in an old Western, with somebody playing honky-tonk piano in the background. It's a good metaphor. I'll explain why. First of all, cyber is all about risk asymmetries. So in the first instance, it's about the socialization of private risk. It's about the globalization of national risk, and it's about the proliferation of supply chain risk. Again, in slightly more detail, key societal functions now rely on network information systems, that's the EU language for cybersecurity systems, provided and sometimes operated by private operators. So those private companies have gone off and done things, but because they now provide services to us as individuals or to the state, their risks are now our risks. We're dependent on them. They're not critical infrastructure, in other words, but they prefer not to be considered as such because that brings burden. And some of those risks are very much in the national security space. Their risks are now vulnerabilities that are there to be exploited by states and other parties who would wish to damage not just individuals or companies, but the state as a whole, the country. Now, this seems like a throwaway remark. It's much worse and it's much more complex than this. That's true. It is. This is a very high-level approach. Secondly, this involves the globalization of national risks and the nationalization of global risks. So these risks are inherently multinational in nature and sometimes global, and they depend on vendor supply chains. These supply chains span different sectors and lead to nested and dendritic vulnerabilities. That means to say that you could have a sector which is dependent, even though you may not know it in the country, on an actor with a vulnerability several steps down the supply chain, which might be 3 countries distant from you. So you might be reliant on a vendor which is based in a different country, but that vendor themselves might have a software or supply chain vulnerability in a 3rd, 4th, or 5th country. So this gets much more complex than just that guy over there has fallen over. That person, your immediate vendor, may not even know they have a problem. And vulnerabilities and tools are therefore universally shared and often in real time. In other words, someone compromises a system, a service, breaks something somewhere, you may not have any warning. It might fall over instantly. So this is obviously a dramatic problem for states. And lastly, supply chain risks apply to processes, products, and services, and to people. So cyber is not just a simple, issue of malware or code. It's a much more diverse, complex set of systems. And also they can be global in 20 minutes. The CrowdStrike incident took 15 minutes to become a global issue. That's cybersecurity. State of play really quickly, and I'm conscious that we're already 11 minutes in. So where we are today in the risk process, we have a new national cyber risk assessment underway It's fairly well advanced now, and it's premised heavily on a lot of work happening at the EU level in the background on various different things. But I'll break it down really quickly. We have ongoing and significant problems in the vendor ecosystem. People are shipping products, processes, and things that are broken. And because both of the increasingly critical nature of those vulnerabilities and issues, and the fact that these services are becoming increasingly critical to the functioning of society, we have an increased level of risk. And it's not going away. This is a global problem. Secondly, technological change is making it easier for actors of all kinds, not just states, actors of all kinds, to deliver and develop really effective attacks. The simple way of describing this is that the delta between a well-protected system that is, immune to 95% of attacks and a reasonable attacker is getting narrower and narrower. So you have situations, and we've seen it in the retail sector in the UK recently, where relatively poorly resourced attackers could take down major supermarket chains. They do this because they can use large language model AI. They can use open source code repositories like GitHub, but there are many others. They can use a well-developed criminal ecosystem to pull together different tools to create dynamic, dangerous attacks, which means that even if you're well prepared, you now have an increased level of vulnerability. And lastly, the geopolitical environment has fundamentally changed. Some of this is very obvious. We know that there's been a major war in Europe since, at the very least, since February 2022. We know that the implicit barriers to state action are lifted, and we have a broader range of offensive cyber activities being undertaken by threat actors, most locally China and Russia. The China thing is important. If you look at what happens in the US with Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, and Flax Typhoon, I won't give you the details, look them up. Each of those are substantial, dramatic cybersecurity incidents, each of which demonstrate very openly that some states no longer care about being caught, and they're willing to engage in what would otherwise be regarded as highly escalatory activities. So the world has shifted under our feet. We're focused on, obviously, on what's happening in Europe, but in a broader sense, the world is becoming much more dramatic and much less safe. So moving on. So what's happening? So focusing on the NIS directive, NIS 1. This happened in 2016, entered into Irish law in 2018. Essentially what we did was, reflecting on the previous risks and using European law, we went out and we designated across 7 critical industry sectors, almost 100 critical infrastructure entities. We went to them, we told them legally, you are now critical. There's a second category of digital service providers. Let's not worry about that. It's too much detail for this point. But what that meant was they were bound to meet formal minimum security requirements, which we then enforced on them, and the central bank did in some cases. They were bound to meet to report significant incidents to us. So we were now in a situation where we had incident reports, we still have incident reports coming from these entities in the NCSC, and we're also then going door to door, auditing, inspecting, checking in an ongoing process to improve the resilience of those entities. So that's 100 odd, and then there's 25 more-ish in DSP space. Again, let's not go into it. That's great, but it's only a reasonable start. The EU in the intervening period, so NIS originally was 2016, we've 5 more specifically cybersecurity pieces of legislation, and then a whole range more like the SA, AI Act, and so on, which all have an involvement. Critically, in the middle of all of this was a substantial revision of the NIS directive, which was signed off in 2022, entered into force in the EU late last year. Our legislation is pending now. So the directive is very large, won't go into the detail. We have a substantial reference guide on our website. There it is. Go have a look if you're interested. In fact, even if you're not, you still probably should. Key thing to remember about NIS 2, scope is far larger. So like I said, 100 plus 25 in NIS 1. Our estimation right now is that we will have something of the order of 3,500 entities in NIS 2. So we're going from 125 to 3,500. Secondly, we're federating compliance. So unlike NIS 1, where we are, National Competent Authority, or NCA, in respect of 507, and Central Bank in respect of 2, we will likely now have 11 different or more national competent authorities. And some of those NCAs are entities like CREW, who deal with energy and water and so on. On the right, you'll see the new sectors of high criticality and the other critical sectors. I'll explain what those mean in slightly more detail. But one thing to keep in mind very quickly, if you look at the oblong blob in the upper sector where you have digital infrastructure, including cloud, ISP, and telecoms, that's done on a main establishment basis. So in other words, if you were home to a large multinational, for example, like a cloud provider or a DNS service provider or a content delivery system and so on, and they're providing services in other European jurisdictions, then it is the main establishment which is responsible for their compliance work. That means we are going to be, as a state, responsible for the compliance with the directive of many of the largest companies in the world, which obviously has some significant implications. Comreg have been designated as the regulator for that space. We're working with all of the regulators. We have a formal group called the NCA Forum, which we work through all of this with them. It's a huge deal. There's more as well for the NCSC, but let's come back to that. Really quickly, there's two different categories of entities. Essential are the ones above the line, important are the ones below. Essential entities have ex post and ex ante regulation. So audits, regular and targeted security audits, that has on-site and off-site inspections and supervision. It's a substantial workload. So all of these regulators will be bringing with them a substantial workload. The important entities, the one on the other side, are ex post only. So it's only after they have an incident, it's only if they have a problem that the regulator is engaged with them. It's a minor but relatively important piece. Importantly, the obligations are the same. So it doesn't matter where you are, essential or important, you have to take the same security measures, which I'll come back to in a second. So that's that. So compliance methods. Now, this is something we only published 2 weeks ago, so this is fairly new. We are taking a different approach to compliance with NIS2 as we did to NIS1 for a number of reasons, scale being an obvious important one. We've published in draft, they're complete, but we obviously no statutory basis, so we have to wait for that, a set of risk management measures or RIMs. And those are fully complete set of security measures that entities under NIS2 will have to meet in this state. Okay, based on the US NIST Cybersecurity Framework, CSF 2.0, but it meets all of the expanded requirements of NIS2. On the other hand, we have something called CYFUN, or the Cyber Fundamentals Framework. This is a formal certification system which was created originally by our Belgian colleagues in CCB, but we've now joined. So we're now a co-owner of CYFUN. It's a formal certification system. We hope to, over the next couple of years, formally accredit this in the state ourselves, and then use this as a basis, not just for NIS2 compliance, but for a whole range of other things, which we can go back to in a moment if people really want. Okay, that's where we are. We're waiting on the legislation for NIS2 to be finally published, go into the Oireachtas. We expect it to go through the democratic process in the autumn, and at some point later on this year, we'll then get the powers under NIS2. So what do we have to do to be ready for that? Well, a couple of things. Under NIS2, we're going to have the following roles in the NCSC. So we have to register all of the essential important entities. We have to hold a register, which we then share with the EU. We have to be the single point of contact within the European Union, including for all of those multinational digital companies. So we have to be the entity that if there is a problem in one of those companies that coordinates the EU response. That's on us. We have to set national standards for and assist NCAs. So CYFUN and RIMs are about that. We have to run a new coordinated vulnerability disclosure process, which is very well advanced at this point. We have a whole range of information sharing work. And then we have at the bottom 3 separate EU networks to interact with. NIS Cooperation Group, the Cyclone Network, and the CSIRS network, the last one. Just put a pin in Cyclone for a second. Cyclone is the link between the political system and cybersecurity authorities in the European Union. It's made up of directors of EU NCSCs. And obviously, during the presidency process, you end up chairing those Cyclone meetings. So it'll be a busy second half of next year for me particularly. That's the roles and responsibilities. What we're doing in the background is building a whole range of different technology solutions and services, including NCDS, come back to that in a second, completely transforming our own digital infrastructure, and then building an entirely new information security system for the NCSC. So our own cybersecurity, physical security, information security, personnel security, and so on. So NCDS, really quickly, this is an obligation that's on us in the directive to create an active cyber defense system. We prefer to call it NCDS because active sounds like it might be slightly aggressive. As you can see, this will involve a whole range of new services which are in development right now, including identification, so surface management, domain check services. We have a long-standing sensor program, which is being revamped and expanded laterally and vertically. And we have an entirely new early warning service and so on. So these will do lots of things. It will give the operations team a whole new set of dashboards to understand what the national risks are, where the vulnerabilities and issues are. But it will also then give us the ability to understand what's happening in the state and to give government and across government a better understanding of exactly where we stand. We also have obviously a larger digital transformation process because we need to arrive at a situation where individual citizens and businesses can not alone contact us directly, but can avail of services from us automatically. So if they have a suspicious email, if they have a requirement of the state to better secure themselves, we have to be able to help them. And that's what this is building towards. And also, obviously, we need much better data analytics and insights to help inform government, the minister, and so on. We also, because the ops team has been accredited for nearly a decade at this point, we're completely reviewing how we do our operations functions. Some more of this will, in the next slide, I'll refer to again in a second. But essentially, the ops team are now getting a whole load of new tools and a whole lot of new information and new legal capabilities. We have to make sure that we manage all of those properly, not just so that we remain secure ourselves, but also so that we can stand over the governance of everything that we do. On the path of the new legislation, the NCSC will fall under the Office of the Independent Examiner. So we have an existing standing oversight arrangement that we will have to continue to meet. And that's what this is about. And then lastly, and I'm pretty much on time, we have a new national cybersecurity strategy. So to rehearse quickly, the first strategy was written and published in 2015. The second one in 2019. There was a substantial review in 2023, which really amounts to a new strategy in and of itself. And now we're going again. This has been drawn up by the cybersecurity policy team in the Department of Justice. They have substantial amount of work done on this already, and hopefully there'll be a public consultation before year end. But this will set out our tasks, once it's approved by government, for the next couple of years. So everything we're doing has to build towards the understanding that it might all change. So that's me. I'm happy to take any questions. This is a whistle-stop tour. Giving academic lectures on this, I try to narrow it down to under 2 hours, not always successfully. So there's lots of questions there to ask.
This podcast is brought to you by the IIEA, sharing ideas, shaping policy.